The story begins in 1969, the year the United States Navy established its elite fighter weapons school. While its official title sounds formal and prestigious, among naval aviators it quickly earns a far more famous nickname, Top Gun. The base is alive with energy as ambitious young pilots arrive, each determined to prove they belong among the best of the best. Into this environment rides Captain Pete Maverick Mitchell, roaring onto the base on his motorcycle. His reputation arrives long before he does. Known for taking risks and refusing to play by the rules, Maverick is preparing for another high-stakes assignment, testing an advanced experimental aircraft designed to push the boundaries of speed and maneuverability. But his enthusiasm hits an obstacle when he discovers that Rear Admiral Chester "Hammer" Kane is heading to the facility. The admiral intends to terminate the entire program because of growing concerns over safety and escalating costs. Rather than accept defeat, Maverick decides to make one final statement. Climbing into the cutting-edge scramjet, he launches into the sky. Once airborne, he begins pushing the aircraft beyond its expected capabilities. The engineers and crew watch in disbelief as the jet exceeds its projected performance, blasting past Mach 9 and eventually reaching the unbelievable speed of Mach 10. For a moment, everyone is stunned by what they are witnessing. Yet Maverick isn't satisfied. Driven by his obsession with speed, he keeps accelerating. The aircraft begins to strain under the pressure, and moments later, catastrophe strikes. The scramjet tears apart, crashing in a violent explosion and leaving destruction scattered across the desert. Miraculously, Maverick survives with only minor injuries. Rear Admiral Kane is furious. He prepares to hold Maverick accountable for the disaster, but before he can do so, unexpected orders arrive. Maverick is being reassigned immediately to Naval Air Station North Island. Upon arriving there, Maverick is welcomed by two senior officers, Admiral Bo Cyclone Simpson and Admiral Solomon Warlock Bates. They brief him on a critical mission unlike anything the Navy has attempted before. A hostile nation has constructed a heavily fortified uranium enrichment facility hidden within mountainous terrain. The target must be destroyed, and Maverick's job is to prepare a new generation of pilots for the operation. Despite his years of experience, Maverick is uncertain. He questions whether he is the right person to train these aviators and lead them toward success. Cyclone doesn't hide his skepticism. In fact, he openly agrees with Maverick's doubts. Warlock, however, sees things differently. He believes Maverick's unique instincts, fearless attitude, and unconventional teaching style are exactly what these young pilots need if they are going to survive the impossible mission ahead. Later that evening, Maverick visits a local bar and receives an unexpected surprise. Standing there is Penny Benjamin, a woman from his past. Years earlier, Maverick disappeared from her life without offering any explanation, creating tension not only between them but also with her father, who had once served as Maverick's commanding officer. To his surprise, Penny greets him warmly despite everything that happened between them. The reunion quickly becomes awkward when Penny decides to buy drinks for everyone in the crowded bar, including a group of talented but overly confident naval aviators. Among them is Jake Hangman, Saracen, whose swagger and self-confidence instantly stand out. The group also includes Natasha Phoenix Trace, the reliable Robert Bob Floyd, Ruben Payback, Fitch, and the energetic Mickey Fanboy Garcia. As the evening continues, the pilots boast about their abilities and compete for attention. Then Bradley Bradshaw enters. The sight of him immediately unsettles Maverick. Rooster is the son of Nick Goose Bradshaw, Maverick's closest friend and former radar intercept officer who died years earlier during a tragic training accident. Seeing him brings back memories Maverick has spent years trying to bury. To make matters worse, Maverick discovers that his credit card has been declined. Taking full advantage of the situation, Hangman and Payback jokingly toss him out of the bar, much to everyone else's amusement. Outside, Maverick pauses when he hears music drifting through the doorway. Rooster is sitting at the piano. The melody instantly reminds him of Goose, who used to play with the same passion and enthusiasm. The moment stirs old feelings of guilt that Maverick has never fully escaped. Wanting to settle what he owes, Maverick later returns and hands Penny an envelope filled with cash. The following day, Penny invites him aboard her sailboat. Away from the noise and pressure of the base, they spend time catching up, sharing memories, and cautiously trying to repair the relationship that had been left unfinished years ago. Meanwhile, training preparations begin. Gathering the pilots together, Maverick delivers a serious briefing. He warns them about the dangers awaiting them during the mission, emphasizing how flying too high could cause oxygen deprivation and loss of consciousness. Maintaining the correct altitude, he explains, will be essential if they hope to complete the attack successfully. When the training exercises begin, clear differences emerge among the pilots. Rooster flies carefully and methodically, rarely taking unnecessary risks. Hangman, on the other hand, thrives on provocation. During one exchange, he references Maverick's history with Goose, igniting tensions between himself and Rooster. The argument quickly escalates, and the other pilots are forced to intervene before it turns into a full fight. Not long afterward, Maverick receives a message from an old friend. Tom "Iceman" Kazansky wants to see him. Years have passed since their rivalry evolved into friendship. Unfortunately, Iceman is now battling throat cancer and can communicate only through a computer. During their meeting, Maverick opens up about his fears regarding Rooster. He worries that if he pushes Goose's son too hard, history could repeat itself. Iceman listens carefully before reminding him of an important truth. The young pilots need him, Rooster needs him, and avoiding responsibility won't protect anyone. Though weakened by illness, Iceman's words carry tremendous weight. The conversation renews Maverick's sense of purpose and gives him the confidence to move forward. The next morning, Cyclone walks onto the runway expecting to find pilots training. Instead, the area is completely empty. Confused, he begins searching the base until he finally discovers Maverick and the recruits gathered on the beach. Shirtless and enjoying the sunshine, they are playing an intense game of beach volleyball, building teamwork and camaraderie in a way only Maverick could justify. Cyclone watches the beach activity with visible disapproval, clearly unconvinced by what he's seeing. To him, it looks more like a day off than military preparation. Maverick, however, argues that the game serves a much larger purpose. Building trust and chemistry between pilots, he explains, can be just as important as flight training. Judging by the laughter, friendly competition, and growing camaraderie among the team, his unconventional approach appears to be paying off. Later, Maverick spends more time with Penny. The two walk together along the shoreline, away from the pressures of the mission. During their conversation, Maverick opens up about a burden he has carried for years. He tells her about Rooster's mother and the promise he made before her death. She had asked him to look after her son, and ever since, Maverick has felt personally responsible for Rooster's future and safety. Back at the base, training intensifies. The pilots are pushed harder than ever as they attempt to replicate the conditions of the actual mission. Their objective is incredibly difficult, executing a precision strike on a heavily defended target while navigating dangerous terrain. Despite their determination, nobody manages to complete the exercise successfully. The challenge proves far more demanding than expected. During one attempt, Phoenix is forced to eject from her aircraft before it crashes, highlighting just how dangerous the mission will be. Following the failed exercise, Maverick reviews the pilot's performance. He singles out Rooster's approach, criticizing him for being overly cautious and hesitant during critical moments. The criticism immediately sparks tension. Rooster, already carrying years of resentment, fires back. He accuses Maverick of interfering with his career and holding him back from opportunities that could have advanced his future. Emotions rise quickly, and the confrontation threatens to spiral out of control. Before either man can say more, Warlock arrives carrying devastating news. Tom "Iceman" Kazansky has passed away. The announcement leaves everyone stunned. Soon afterward, a solemn funeral is held to honor Iceman's life and service. Maverick, Penny, and the entire group of pilots gather alongside fellow Navy personnel to pay their final respects. The atmosphere is heavy with grief. For Maverick especially, the loss feels deeply personal. He has lost not only a legendary pilot, but also one of the few people who truly understood him. In the days that follow, morale remains low. As evening settles over the base, Cyclone assumes direct control of the training program. He presents a revised strategy for the mission, believing a more conservative approach will increase their chances of success. The pilots listen carefully but remain uncertain. Many question whether Cyclone's plan can realistically achieve the objective under the strict time limitations they face. Then, without warning, a familiar roar echoes across the airfield. Heads turn toward the runway. An FA-118 launches into the sky at incredible speed. It's Maverick. Determined to prove what is possible, he takes one of the fighter jets into the air and begins flying the mission profile himself. Radar operators watch in disbelief as he navigates the challenging course with extraordinary precision. Every maneuver is executed flawlessly. He dives through the terrain, threads the aircraft through narrow passages, and reaches the target exactly within the required time frame. At the final moment, he scores a successful strike with only seconds remaining. The demonstration leaves everyone speechless. Pilots who had questioned his methods now witness firsthand why Maverick remains one of the most respected aviators in the Navy. His performance doesn't just validate the mission, it proves that it can actually be accomplished. With confidence restored, preparations for the real operation begin immediately. When the strike team is finalized, Maverick personally selects Rooster as his wingman. Joining them are Hangman, Phoenix, Fanboy, Payback, and Bob, while the remaining pilots stay on standby in case they are needed. The mission begins. Flying low through rugged terrain, the team races toward enemy territory while avoiding detection. Mountains and valleys flash past at incredible speeds as missile systems constantly threaten to lock onto their aircraft. At one point, Rooster falls behind the formation. For a tense moment, it appears he may lose position altogether. Fortunately, he regains control and quickly returns to formation. Meanwhile, the aircraft carrier supporting the mission launches a wave of Tomahawk missiles toward the enemy's airfield. The attack damages the runway and disrupts enemy operations, forcing hostile fighters to respond under chaotic conditions. As the strike team reaches the target area, timing becomes everything. Working together with perfect coordination, they launch their attack. The uranium enrichment facility is hit directly. A massive explosion erupts as the target is completely destroyed. But their job isn't finished. Enemy aircraft are already moving in to intercept them. As the pilots begin their escape, hostile fighters close the distance rapidly. Missiles streak through the sky. Warning alarms blare inside the cockpits. During the retreat, Rooster's aircraft comes under direct threat. Before disaster can strike, Maverick places himself between Rooster and the incoming attack, sacrificing his own safety to protect him. Moments later, Maverick's jet is struck. The aircraft spirals out of control and crashes deep inside enemy territory. Believing Maverick may be dead, the rest of the team is left shocked. On the ground, however, Maverick survives. His situation remains desperate. An enemy helicopter quickly locates him and begins closing in for the kill. Just as the helicopter prepares to fire, a missile slams into it, engulfing it in flames. Maverick looks up and sees the impossible. Rooster has come back for him. Ignoring orders and risking his own life, Rooster has returned to rescue the man he once blamed for so much of his pain. But the danger isn't over. Enemy defenses lock onto Rooster's aircraft, and within seconds, a missile strikes. With no chance of saving the jet, Rooster ejects and barely escapes before the aircraft is destroyed. Now stranded behind enemy lines together, Maverick and Rooster must find another way home. Gunfire echoes in the distance as they race across hostile territory. Searching for options, Maverick spots an aging F-1 Ford fighter sitting inside a nearby enemy base. The idea sounds completely insane. When Maverick explains the plan, Rooster can hardly believe what he's hearing. Still, they have no better alternative. The pair rush toward the aircraft, climb inside, and somehow manage to get the engines running. Within moments, they are airborne. Enemy fighters immediately give chase. The sky erupts into a chaotic dogfight filled with missiles, tracer rounds, and desperate evasive maneuvers. Using every ounce of his experience, Maverick manages to shoot down two pursuing aircraft through a combination of gunfire and defensive countermeasures. Eventually, however, they run out of ammunition. Their situation becomes critical. A third enemy fighter lines up behind them, preparing to deliver the finishing blow. With nowhere left to run, Maverick and Rooster brace for the worst. Then, out of nowhere, another jet streaks across the sky. A missile launches. The pursuing enemy aircraft explodes instantly. Their rescuer is Hangman. Having arrived at the last possible moment, he saves both Maverick and Rooster from certain destruction. Relieved and exhausted, the trio finally begins the journey home. When Maverick and Rooster land safely aboard the carrier, the entire crew erupts in celebration. Cheers echo across the flight deck. Pilots and sailors rush forward, offering handshakes, hugs, and congratulations. Even Hangman, normally too proud to show much emotion, gives Rooster a respectful nod of approval. It's a small gesture, but one that means a great deal. As the excitement settles, Maverick notices a change in Rooster. The uncertainty that once defined him has disappeared. In its place is confidence, courage, and a quiet strength. For a brief moment, Rooster reminds Maverick of Goose, not just in appearance, but in spirit. The two men exchange a meaningful look. No words are necessary. The ordeal they survived together has finally repaired the bond between them. Sometime later, inside a hangar, Maverick works on restoring a vintage P-51 Mustang. Rooster joins him, helping with the project as the two continue rebuilding their friendship. Penny eventually arrives, and Maverick invites her to join him for a flight. Together, they climb into the aircraft and take off into the open sky. Back in the hangar, Rooster pauses before placing a recent photograph of himself and Maverick beside an older picture showing Maverick and Goose many years earlier. The two photographs sit side by side, a quiet symbol of healing, friendship, and a legacy that has finally come full circle. When WTH Top Gun: Maverick was first announced, I think a lot of people had the same reaction. Really? A sequel to Top Gun after more than 3 decades? Because on paper, this is exactly the kind of movie that usually sounds like a bad idea. Not even a risky idea. A bad one. The kind of late sequel that shows up years later, leans too hard on nostalgia, brings back the old music, recreates a few famous shots, throws in a younger cast, and then expects the audience to clap just because they recognize the jacket. And, to be fair, there was every reason to be skeptical. The original Top Gun is not just a movie for a lot of people. It is a memory. It belongs to a very specific time, with a very specific kind of Hollywood confidence. Fast jets, sunsets, leather jackets, loud music, impossible hair, and that whole 1980s blockbuster attitude where subtlety was not exactly the priority. Some people love it for that. Some people find it completely ridiculous for the exact same reason. So bringing it back decades later could have gone wrong in so many ways. It could have felt desperate. It could have felt like a museum piece. It could have felt like Tom Cruise walking through a greatest hits album with fighter jets in the background. And honestly, before watching it, I would not have blamed anyone for thinking, do we really need this? Because Hollywood has trained us to be suspicious of these things. Every few months, another old title gets pulled out of storage, polished up, and sold back to us with the promise that this time, the nostalgia actually means something. Sometimes it does. A lot of the time, it really doesn't. But Top Gun: Maverick is interesting because it arrives with all of that baggage already attached to it. It knows people remember the first film. It knows people want the music, the speed, the aircraft, the old emotional buttons. But it also has to prove that it is not just here to remind you of something you used to like. That is the difficult part. A sequel like this cannot just say, "Remembered Top Gun?" for 2 hours. That might get a smile for a few minutes, maybe even a cheer in the theater, but it will not carry a full movie. At some point, the film has to stand on its own legs, or maybe in this case, its own wings, and that is where the surprise comes in. Because against all odds, this is not the lifeless nostalgia sequel it easily could have been. It is very much built on the memory of the original. Yes, there is no pretending otherwise. The film absolutely wants you to feel that connection, but it also understands that time has passed. Maverick is older. The world around him has changed. The audience has changed too. That is what gives the movie its first real hook. This is not just Top Gun again. It is a movie about returning to something after too much time has passed and realizing that the old magic is still there, but it cannot exist in exactly the same way anymore. And that, for me, is why the film becomes more compelling than the simple idea of a legacy sequel. It is not starting from a place of confidence. It is starting from doubt. Can this still work? Can this character still matter? Can this kind of big, sincere, old-school action movie still hit an audience the way it used to? Those questions are sitting underneath the whole opening stretch of the film, whether the movie says them out loud or not. And honestly, that is a smart place to begin, because the audience is asking the same thing. A sequel arriving 36 years later should feel out of place. It should feel late. It should feel like it missed its window. But Top Gun: Maverick takes that exact problem and turns it into the reason the story exists. And when we meet Maverick again, the film makes something clear pretty quickly. This man has not exactly moved on. He is older, obviously. The face has changed a little. The years are there. But in almost every meaningful way, Pete Mitchell is still Pete Mitchell, still flying, still testing limits, still irritating the people above him. Still acting like rules are less like rules, and more like polite suggestions from people who do not understand the sky the way he does. And there is something kind of funny about that at first. because technically, Maverick should not be where he is anymore. After all these years in the Navy, he should probably be sitting behind a desk somewhere with a much bigger title, giving orders instead of breaking them. He should be an admiral by now, or at least someone with enough rank to stop being treated like a problem that needs managing. But that never happened. He is still a captain. And the movie does not treat that as just a random detail. It matters. It says almost everything about who Maverick is at this point in his life. This is a man who could have climbed higher, but climbing higher would have meant leaving behind the one thing he actually understands, flying. That is the tragedy and the charm of him. Maverick is not built for offices. He is not built for politics. He is not built for quietly accepting that his best days are supposed to be behind him. Put him in a room full of admirals and he looks uncomfortable almost instantly. Put him inside a cockpit and suddenly the whole movie feels like it has found oxygen again. That is where he belongs. But the interesting thing is, the film does not present this as purely heroic. It is not just, look how cool he is, he never changed. There is a sadness underneath it too, because not changing can look exciting from the outside, especially when it involves fighter jets and Tom Cruise doing Tom Cruise things. But emotionally, it can also mean being stuck. Maverick has survived by staying in motion, flying faster, pushing harder, dodging promotion, dodging responsibility. Dodging the parts of life that might force him to stop and actually look at what he has been carrying all these years. So when the film opens with him still out there testing experimental aircraft, still chasing impossible numbers, it feels thrilling, yes, but also a little lonely. He is not surrounded by old friends, he is not settled, he is not really at peace, he is just still going. And that is a smart place to find him. Because if this sequel had brought Maverick back as some perfectly adjusted senior officer, I do not think it would have worked the same way. The whole point is that he is still brilliant, still reckless, still useful, but also out of step with the world around him. The Navy has changed. Technology has changed. The younger pilots have changed. Even the idea of what a fighter pilot means has started to shift. But Maverick? Maverick is still holding on to the same instinct that made him famous in the first place. When everyone else says something cannot be done, he wants to prove that it can. The difference now is that the movie is no longer asking whether that makes him cool. It is asking what that has cost him. So naturally, the only place the movie can send him is back to Top Gun. And I like that the film does not bring him back in some clean, sentimental way. It is not like Maverick gets a warm invitation, walks through the doors, and everyone applauds because the legend has returned. It is messier than that. He is not wanted by everybody. In fact, depending on who you ask, he is barely wanted at all. He is brought back because of a problem. There is a mission coming up that looks almost impossible, and the Navy needs pilots good enough, reckless enough, and disciplined enough to survive it. That combination is rare. And whether the people in charge like it or not, Maverick understands that kind of flying better than anyone. That is the funny contradiction of the character. He is the guy the system keeps trying to push aside. But whenever the situation becomes too extreme, that same system suddenly remembers why it kept him around in the first place. So he returns to Top Gun, but this time not as the young hotshot trying to prove himself. Now he is supposed to be the instructor, the mentor, the older figure standing in front of the new generation and telling them how far they have to go. And honestly, that is a clever reversal, because the first film was about Maverick trying to earn his place among the best. This one is about him being forced to teach the best, while still not being completely sure he is built for teaching at all. He knows how to fly, he knows how to survive, he knows how to do things that look insane on paper. But teaching that to someone else is different. There is a difference between being gifted and being responsible for other people's lives, and that is where the sequel starts to find its own tension. Maverick cannot just be the wild card anymore. He cannot simply jump in the cockpit, break the rules, and smile his way out of trouble. Now, every instinct he has affects the younger pilots watching him, and the film understands how uncomfortable that is for him. Maverick is not naturally a classroom guy. He is not someone who explains himself beautifully with a marker in his hand and a calm voice. His language is flying. His lesson plan is basically, get in the air and try to keep up. That gives the return to Top Gun a purpose beyond nostalgia. Yes, we are back in familiar territory. The uniforms, the hangars, the competitive pilots, the old-school military atmosphere, it is all there. But the emotional position has changed. Maverick is not trying to become the future anymore. He is trying to prepare the future, even while part of him still refuses to admit that his own time has shifted. And that is why the setup works better than it probably should. The movie does not just drag Maverick back to Top Gun because the audience remembers the name. It brings him back because that place now forces him to face everything he has avoided: authority, age, responsibility, legacy, and the uncomfortable truth that being the best pilot in the room is no longer enough. What makes Top Gun: Maverick feel different from the first film is how quickly it gives itself a spine. The original Top Gun had a looser shape. It was partly a training movie, partly a rivalry movie, partly a romance, partly a music video with fighter jets and sweaty volleyball. It had a story, sure, but a lot of its appeal came from just hanging around that world. The attitude, the uniforms, the competition, the whole glossy fantasy of being young, talented, arrogant, and faster than everyone else. Maverick is more focused than that. This time, the movie is built around one mission. Not a vague idea of becoming better pilots. Not just classroom tension and ego battles until the final act decides to throw in combat. From fairly early on, we know what these pilots are training for. We know the target, we know the risks. We know the margin for error is almost non-existent. That gives the whole film a different rhythm. Every training scene has a purpose. Every failure means something. Every argument about timing, altitude, speed, and survival is connected to one final test that the movie keeps moving toward. You can feel the film narrowing its focus as it goes along, almost like it is tightening a wire, and that helps a lot. Because with a movie like this, the plot does not need to be complicated. In fact, it probably works better because it is not complicated. The story is clean enough that the audience can understand the mission almost immediately, which means the tension does not come from confusion. It comes from watching people try to do something that looks impossible even when you understand it perfectly. That is a very old-school adventure movie pleasure. You do not need a dozen twists. You do not need 20 factions or a villain giving speeches in the shadows. You just need a clear objective, a limited amount of time, and characters we do not want to see fail. And for the most part, the movie gets that right. It takes Maverick, a character who has spent his life surviving by instinct, and places him inside a structure where instinct alone is not enough. He has to train other people to survive the kind of danger he would normally take on himself. That instantly changes the emotional pressure of the story. Because the mission is not just about whether Maverick can still fly. We already know he can. The real question is whether he can prepare others to fly into something this dangerous and then live with the consequences of what he asks them to do. That is where the mission-driven structure becomes more than just a plot device. It forces Maverick into a different kind of conflict. He cannot simply be the guy who breaks the rules anymore. He has to explain why the rules might need to be broken, and he has to do it in a way that gives these younger pilots a real chance. So even when the film follows familiar beats, the structure keeps it moving. There is a countdown feeling underneath everything. The characters may joke, compete, flirt, and clash, but the mission is always waiting in the background. And the closer they get to it, the less this feels like a nostalgic reunion tour. It starts to feel like a test. And the mission itself is where the movie really starts to lock in. Because on paper, it is almost absurd. The pilots have to fly low, move fast, avoid enemy defenses, survive mountain terrain, hit an extremely small target, and somehow make it back out before the whole thing turns into a disaster. It is the kind of mission that sounds less like a military operation and more like someone designed a death trap and then asked, "Okay, who wants to volunteer?" But that is also why it works. The movie is very smart about making the audience understand the danger without drowning everything in technical language. There is enough aviation talk to make the world feel serious, but not so much that you feel locked out of the scene. You do not need to understand every detail about altitude, timing, missiles, or G-force to understand the basic problem. They have to do something almost impossible. And if they get it wrong, even slightly, people are not coming home. That clarity matters. A lot. Because in a movie like this, the stakes cannot just be spoken, they have to be felt. And AST Top Gun, Maverick builds that feeling by making the mission look brutal long before anyone actually flies into enemy territory. The training runs are not just practice scenes, they are warnings. Every failed attempt shows us another way this mission can go wrong. Too slow, and they are exposed. Too high, and they are detected. Too late, and they miss the window. Too much pressure, and the body itself starts to fail. The film keeps stacking those risks until the mission stops feeling like a standard action movie objective and starts feeling like a test of nerve, instinct, and physical endurance. And that gives the training scenes real tension. Usually in this kind of movie, you know the training is just there to prepare us for the good stuff later. Here, the training is the good stuff too, because the characters are already fighting the mission before they ever reach it. They are fighting the clock. They are fighting their own limits. They are fighting the fear that Maverick might be asking them to do something that simply cannot be done. That is also where Maverick's role becomes more complicated. He is not just telling them, be brave. That would be easy. He is trying to teach them how to survive something that may not be survivable. And because he knows exactly how dangerous it is, every lesson carries this quiet pressure underneath it. He is pushing them hard because he has to, but he is also looking at these pilots and understanding that some of them may not come back. That shadow hangs over the whole middle of the film. It is not dark in a grim, heavy way. This is still a big, polished, crowd-pleasing blockbuster, but the danger is present enough to give the movie weight. You are never confused about what the characters are training for, and you are never allowed to forget that skill alone might not be enough. That is what makes the setup so satisfying. The mission is simple, yes, very simple, but simple does not mean weak. Sometimes a clean objective is exactly what an action movie needs. Give the audience the target, show them why it is nearly impossible, let them watch the characters fail, adjust, doubt themselves, and try again. By the time the final mission is approaching, the movie has done its job. You know the route, you know the danger, you know what has to happen, and because of that, every second in the air feels like it matters. Now, let's be honest about the story. This is not a complicated movie. Nobody is going to watch Top Gun: Maverick and come away saying, wow, I never knew where that was going. The plot is pretty straightforward. At times, it is predictable. At times, it is openly familiar. You can feel certain emotional beats coming before they arrive, and the movie is not exactly trying to hide them. But here is the thing. That does not automatically make the storytelling weak. In fact, part of why the film works for so many people is because it understands the kind of story it is telling. This is not trying to be some tangled political thriller or a deconstruction of military cinema. It is a clean, old-school adventure story with a clear mission, clear emotional baggage, and clear character stakes. And sometimes that kind of clarity is underrated. The movie gives you exactly enough plot to keep everything moving. Maverick has unfinished business. Rooster has resentment. The younger pilots have to prove themselves. The mission looks impossible. The clock is ticking. That is basically the engine of the film, and it is a strong enough engine to carry the whole thing. Could the writing be deeper in places? Absolutely. Some characters could have had more room. Some conflicts could have been less obvious. Some of the dialogue has that glossy blockbuster quality where people say exactly what the scene needs them to say. And yes, there are moments where the film steps right into cheese without even pretending it is embarrassed. But there is a difference between a movie being simple and a movie being lazy. Maverick is simple, but it is not careless. It knows how to set up information, pay it off later, and keep the audience oriented. That matters more than people sometimes admit. You always understand where the story is, what the characters are trying to do, and why the next scene exists. That is probably why even some of the more conventional material lands better than expected. The film is not reinventing anything. It is arranging familiar pieces with confidence. The reluctant mentor. The angry younger pilot, the old wound, the impossible mission, the romantic reconnection, the authority figure who doubts the hero. These are not new ingredients, but the movie cooks them properly. And that is where a lot of legacy sequels fail. They bring back the old character, add a new generation, throw in references, and hope emotion appears automatically. Top Gun: Maverick is more disciplined than that. It may be predictable, but it usually knows why it is being predictable. There is a comfort in that. You are not watching this film because the plot is going to outsmart you. You are watching because the movie knows how to build momentum, how to create pressure, and how to make familiar emotional beats feel satisfying instead of completely empty. That is not nothing. A conventional story can still work beautifully if the execution has enough energy, sincerity, and craft behind it. And for most of its runtime, Maverick has those things. It is direct, it is polished, it is sometimes corny, but it moves with purpose. And in a blockbuster landscape where some movies confuse complexity with depth, there is something refreshing about a film that simply says, here is the mission. Here are the people. Here is what they have to face. Now watch them fly. Of course, there is no talking about 8's Top Gun Maverick without talking about nostalgia. The movie knows exactly what people came to see. It knows the sound of those engines means something. It knows that certain music cues are going to hit people before a single line of dialogue does. It knows the image of aircraft moving across a glowing sky has been sitting in the memory of the first film's audience for decades. And honestly, the film is not shy about using that. From the opening stretch, Maverick is clearly reaching back. The rhythm feels familiar, the music feels familiar. The whole atmosphere has this deliberate "we are back" quality to it. Not subtle exactly, but not accidental either. It is almost like the movie walks into the room wearing the old jacket and waits to see who recognizes it. And a lot of people did. That is part of the pleasure here. The film understands that Top Gun is not just remembered because of its plot. In fact, for many viewers, the plot might be the least important thing about it. People remember the feeling, the speed, the confidence, the music, the rivalry, the beach scene, the danger, the slightly ridiculous sincerity of it all. So Emmerich brings those things back. You get the familiar echoes. You get the legacy names. You get Goose hanging over the story like an old wound. You get Iceman returning with real emotional weight. You get the bar, the piano, the young pilots measuring each other up, the competitive energy, the romance, the sense that everyone in this world is either trying to prove something or outrun something. And yes, you get Danger Zone, because of course you do. A movie like this was never going to pretend the original did not exist. That would have been dishonest. The whole reason this sequel has power is because time has passed, and the film lets that time sit inside the story. It wants the audience to feel the distance between then and now. That is why the nostalgia works better than it might have. It is not only saying, remember this. It is also asking, what does this memory look like now? The old images come back, but they do not land in exactly the same way. Maverick is not the young pilot trying to become a legend anymore. He is the legend, and that changes the meaning of almost every callback around him. The familiar world is still there, but he does not fit inside it quite as easily. That gives the nostalgia a slightly bittersweet edge. The movie can be exciting and sentimental at the same time. It can bring back the music and still remind you that the people connected to that music have aged, changed, disappeared, or been left behind. And that is where Top Gun Maverick separates itself from the laziest kind of revival. Because the worst nostalgia sequels treat the past like a button. Press it, and the audience reacts. This film does press those buttons, no question. But at its best, it also gives those buttons some emotional context. When the old material returns, it is not just decoration, it is part of Maverick's problem. He is surrounded by reminders of who he used to be, what he lost, and what he still has not dealt with. So the nostalgia is not just fan service. Well, okay, sometimes it is fan service, but it is fan service with the pulse, and that makes a difference. But nostalgia is tricky. Because the same thing that gives Top Gun, Maverick, so much emotional power is also the thing that occasionally makes it feel a little too safe. There are moments where the callbacks work beautifully. You understand why they are there. You feel the history behind them. You can sense the movie using the past to create a heavier emotional atmosphere, especially when Maverick is forced to face the people and memories he has spent years avoiding. That side of the nostalgia is genuinely effective. But then there are other moments where the film gets very close to simply pointing at the original and saying, "You liked this before, right?" And that is where it becomes more complicated. Because yes, the music is exciting, the familiar lines are fun. The beach scene has that big, knowingly cheesy energy. The bar scene has its own kind of charm. But after a while, you can feel the movie walking a very thin line between homage and repetition. Sometimes it lands on the right side of that line, sometimes it does not. And I think your reaction to Top Gun Maverick may depend on how much patience you have for that kind of legacy filmmaking. If you love the original, these echoes might feel like part of the celebration. They might feel like the movie inviting you back into a world you already missed. But if you are less attached to Top Gunning, or if the first movie never meant that much to you, some of those same moments can feel a little obvious, maybe even too calculated. That is the strange balance the film has to manage. It wants to be sincere, but it also wants applause. It wants to move forward, but it keeps looking over its shoulder. It wants to tell a new story, but it knows the old story is the reason most people showed up in the first place. And to be fair, that is not an easy position. A movie like this cannot completely ignore nostalgia. That would almost defeat the purpose. But if it relies on nostalgia too much, then it starts to feel less like a story and more like a carefully arranged memory tour. Maverick mostly avoids that trap, but not always. There are scenes where the emotional weight feels earned, especially when the past is tied to grief, guilt, or aging. Those moments give the callbacks meaning. They remind us that time has not just passed for the audience. It has passed for the characters too. But there are also scenes where the callback is just there. You recognize it, you smile, and then the movie moves on. That is not necessarily terrible. Sometimes a crowd-pleasing moment is allowed to simply please the crowd. Not every reference needs to carry deep thematic weight. But when a film uses that many familiar beats, it does risk becoming predictable in a different way. Not predictable because of the plot, predictable because of the memory. You start to feel when the movie is about to reach back again. You can almost sense it winding up for another echo from 1986. And yet, somehow, even with that criticism, the nostalgia does not sink the film. Because underneath the familiar surfaces, there is still enough feeling, craft, and momentum to keep it alive. That is why I would not call the nostalgia lazy. It is too carefully handled for that. But I would say it is heavy, very heavy in places, and whether that heaviness feels comforting or excessive probably depends on what Top Gun already means to you before the movie even begins. This is where the movie gets interesting, because Top Gun Maverick is not just paying homage to the original, it is also repeating it. And the difference between those two things can be very thin. Homage feels like a conversation with the past. It takes something familiar and gives it a new reason to exist. Repetition is easier. Repetition just says, here's the thing again. Same shape, same rhythm, same emotional button, maybe with better cameras and older actors. Maverick does both. There are moments where the film is clearly recreating the feeling of the first Top Gun, the competitive pilots, the music, the bar energy, the romantic pause between all the military tension, the athletic beach sequence, the old rivalry structure reappearing through a younger cast. You can feel the film arranging certain pieces in ways that are meant to trigger recognition. And sometimes, yes, it is a little obvious. You are watching and thinking, okay, I see what you are doing here. But the reason it does not collapse into pure imitation is because the emotional angle has shifted. The same kinds of scenes do not mean exactly what they meant before. In the original, that competitive energy was about young pilots trying to prove they were the best. In Maverick, that same energy is still there, but now Maverick is watching it from the other side. He is no longer the young guy in the room. He is the older figure looking at a generation that reminds him of who he used to be and maybe of what he lost along the way. That changes everything. The movie may borrow the shape of the first film, but the perspective is different. The nostalgia is not just decoration. At its best, it becomes a way of showing distance. The world looks familiar, but Maverick's place inside it has changed. That is why some of the repeated beats work better than they should. A scene that could have been empty fan service becomes a little more bittersweet because Maverick is not just reliving the past. He's being forced to stand outside it and recognize that time has moved on without asking his permission. Still, the film does not always escape the danger of repetition. There are callbacks that feel meaningful, and then there are callbacks that feel like the movie is checking items off a list. You can almost imagine someone saying, we need the song, we need the beach moment, we need the bar scene, we need the old line, we need the emotional reference to Goose. And when you notice the machinery, the spell weakens a little. But I also think that is part of what makes Maverick such a fascinating legacy sequel. It is not completely free from the habits of modern nostalgia filmmaking. It absolutely wants the audience to recognize things. It wants that instant emotional connection. The difference is that it usually tries to build something on top of that recognition. Not always, but often enough. The film understands that simply repeating Top Gun would not be enough after all this time, so it uses repetition almost like a mirror. It lets Maverick see younger versions of old patterns, old mistakes, old rivalries, and old wounds. And through that, the movie starts to ask whether the past should be preserved, repaired, or finally left behind. That is what separates the stronger moments from the weaker ones. When the film repeats something just to make us remember, it can feel safe. When it repeats something to show how much has changed, it works. And Top Gun Maverick is at its best when it understands that difference. What really helps the sequel, though, is that Maverick himself is not treated like the exact same man from 1986. He is still Maverick. The movie never forgets that. He still has that instinct to push past the limit just because someone told him the limit exists. He still has the same stubborn confidence, the same need to prove that a machine, a rule, or an admiral cannot fully define what a pilot is capable of. But he is not just the reckless young guy anymore. There is more silence around him now, more weight, more history sitting behind his eyes, and that makes him a lot more interesting. The first film gave us Maverick as pure movie star energy. He was charming, arrogant, dangerous, emotional, and sometimes honestly kind of irritating. That was part of the character. He was a young man convinced that talent could outrun consequence. In this film, consequence has caught up. Not in some loud, melodramatic way. He is not walking around giving speeches about pain every 5 minutes, but you can feel it in how he carries himself. He is still fast, still brilliant, still almost impossible to control. But now that recklessness has a different flavor. It does not feel like youthful arrogance anymore. It feels like a man who only knows how to keep living if he keeps moving. That is a subtle but important shift, because the sequel could have easily turned him into a flawless legend. The returning hero, the old master, the guy who walks into the room and instantly proves all the younger pilots are amateurs. And yes, the movie does give him plenty of those moments, but it also lets him look tired. Not weak exactly, just worn down by time, guilt, and the strange loneliness of being someone who never really left the past behind. That is where Tom Cruise's performance matters. Cruise still brings the movie star spark, obviously. That is part of the deal. But the more effective moments are the quieter ones, where Maverick seems caught between the person everyone expects him to be and the person he is afraid he has become. He is a legend, but he does not look fully comfortable being one. He can still fly better than almost anyone, but that does not solve the emotional problems waiting for him on the ground. He can survive dangerous missions, but survival is not the same thing as peace. And for a character like Maverick, that distinction matters. The film understands that age changes the meaning of rebellion. When you are young, breaking the rules can look exciting. When you are older, and you are still breaking the same rules, the question becomes different. Is this courage? Is it stubbornness? Is it purpose? Or is it just the only identity you have left? That question hangs over this version of Maverick, and it gives the movie a little more texture than it might have had otherwise. Because this is not just about whether Maverick can still do the job. The film answers that almost immediately. Of course he can. The more interesting question is, what happens to a man who stayed excellent at one thing while the rest of his life remained unresolved? That is the Maverick we meet here. Still iconic, still dangerous, still impossible to replace. But finally old enough for the movie to ask whether being impossible to replace has also made him impossible to move forward. And at a certain point, you also have to talk about the obvious thing. This movie is Tom Cruise, not just starring Tom Cruise, not just led by Tom Cruise. It is built around the entire idea of Tom Cruise as a movie star. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you feel about him. But in Top Gun: Maverick, it is almost impossible to separate the film from the man at the center of it. The whole thing runs on that particular Cruise energy, the commitment, the intensity, the need to make everything feel bigger, faster, cleaner, sharper, more physical. You can feel him pushing the movie, and honestly, that is a huge part of why it works. Because Maverick is not just a character returning after decades. He is also an image returning. Tom Cruise in the cockpit. Tom Cruise refusing to slow down. Tom Cruise looking at a younger cast and somehow still feeling like the most dangerous person in the room. The film knows this. It uses it completely. There is a slightly funny, almost self-aware quality to it. The younger pilots are supposed to be the new elite, the fresh generation, the future of aviation. But the movie keeps reminding us that Maverick is still the one they cannot touch. He is older than them, outranked by others, written off by the system, and yet the second he gets in the air, the whole hierarchy changes. Suddenly, everyone else is just trying to keep up. That is very much the Tom Cruise mythology too. For years now, Cruise has built this reputation as the last major movie star who seems personally offended by the idea of cheating the audience. If there is a plane, he wants to be near the plane. If there is speed, he wants to feel the speed. If there is danger, he wants the camera close enough for us to believe it. And whether you find that inspiring or slightly insane, it gives the film a kind of sincerity that is hard to fake. Maverick does not feel like a star showing up to collect a paycheck from an old brand name. It feels like someone trying to prove that this kind of movie still matters. That practical spectacle still matters. That big screen action can still make an audience lean forward instead of just watch passively. There is ego in that, of course, a lot of ego. The movie absolutely wants us to believe that Maverick is still better than everybody. It wants us to believe that the old master has lessons no one else can teach. It wants to preserve the legend, not dismantle it. But the strange thing is, Cruise sells it. He sells it because he commits to the physical side of the role, but also because he understands the emotional side of his own screen image. There is swagger here, but it is not empty swagger. It is attached to age, loss, guilt, and the pressure of being someone everyone expects to remain impossible forever. That makes the star persona more interesting than simple vanity. Because yes, this is Tom Cruise doing Tom Cruise things. Absolutely, no one should pretend otherwise. But the movie finds a way to turn that into part of the story. Maverick is also a man who has built his entire identity around being the one who goes further, flies faster, and refuses to stop. So when we watch Cruise pushing himself on screen, it lines up almost perfectly with Maverick's own problem. The actor and the character start reflecting each other. Both are trying to prove they still belong in a world that keeps changing around them. Both are tied to an older style of action filmmaking. Both seem almost allergic to the idea of stepping aside quietly, and that is why the film has the charge that it does. It is not just about a pilot proving he can still fly. It is about a movie star proving that this kind of movie can still take off. But what makes Cruise's return work better than just another victory lap is that the movie does not only lean on his confidence, it lets him look vulnerable, not in a dramatic, crying in the rain kind of way. That would not really fit Maverick. His vulnerability is quieter than that. It comes through in pauses, in hesitation, in the way he reacts when the past suddenly stops being an idea and becomes a person standing in front of him. That is where this version of Maverick feels different. He can still walk into a room with that controlled Tom Cruise intensity. He can still stare down authority figures like he has already calculated 12 ways to disobey them. He can still get into a jet and make everyone else look like they are flying with training wheels. But on the ground, he is not untouchable, and the movie is smart enough to keep bringing him back down there. Because the cockpit is where Maverick feels powerful. That is the place where he can turn fear into instinct. It is where he can solve problems with speed, skill, and nerve. But grief does not work that way. Guilt does not work that way. Time does not work that way. You cannot outfly those things forever. That is the emotional pressure sitting underneath Cruise's performance. There is still swagger, but there is also a kind of fatigue behind it. Not physical fatigue exactly, because the film is very committed to showing that Maverick can still do the job. It is more like emotional exhaustion. A man who has spent decades being defined by movement is finally being forced to stop long enough to feel what he has been carrying. And that is more interesting than just watching him be cool. The moments with Rooster bring this out sharply. Maverick is not simply dealing with a difficult student. He is looking at the son of the friend he lost, the son of the man whose death still follows him around like a shadow. Every conversation between them has something unsaid sitting underneath it. Maverick wants to protect him. Rooster does not want protection from him, and neither of them can talk about Goose without reopening something that never healed properly. That tension gives Cruise a chance to play something more fragile than the usual impossible man action persona. He is still composed, but you can sense the cracks. He is still trying to lead, but he does not always know how to repair what he broke or what he thinks he broke. And then there is Iceman. That scene works because it strips away so much of the old rivalry and leaves behind two men who have aged, suffered, and somehow remained connected. There is no need for the movie to over-explain it. The history is already there. You feel it before anyone says much. For Maverick, that moment is not about being the best pilot in the room. It is about facing someone who truly knows him, someone who can see past the legend and recognize the man who is still stuck. That is where the vulnerability becomes the point. Because Maverick's problem is not that he has lost his skill. He has not. The film makes that very clear. His problem is that skill has been his answer to everything, and now he is facing questions that flying cannot answer. Can he forgive himself? Can he let Rooster go? Can he accept that the past matters without letting it control the rest of his life? Those are not the loudest parts of the movie, but they are some of the most important, and Cruise, to his credit, does not overplay them. He lets Maverick remain guarded. He lets the emotions sit underneath the surface, which honestly feels right for this character. Maverick is not suddenly going to become a man who explains every feeling in perfect sentences. He is still Maverick. But now, when he smiles, there is history behind it. When he goes quiet, there is weight there. And when he flies, it no longer feels like just a thrill. It feels like escape. One of the more interesting things about Top Gun: Maverick is that it does not treat Maverick's refusal to change as purely heroic. At first, it almost looks that way. He is still the guy who will push the aircraft further than anyone else. Still the guy who looks at a limit and immediately starts wondering whether that limit is real. Still the guy who annoys every superior officer in the room because, frustratingly, he is usually right about what he can do. That kind of stubbornness is fun to watch. It is part of why Maverick works as a character. He has always been the man who refuses to accept the safe answer, the easy answer, or the official answer. And in a movie like this, that is exciting. Nobody comes to Top Gun hoping the main character will calmly follow procedure and fill out paperwork. But the sequel adds something important. It asks what happens when that same stubbornness keeps a man alive professionally, but frozen emotionally. Because Maverick has not just refused promotion, he has refused movement. Real movement. The kind that happens inside a person. The kind that forces you to admit that time has passed, people are gone, and the version of yourself you keep protecting may not be enough anymore. That is why his rank matters. On the surface, being stuck as a captain is almost a joke. It tells us Maverick never learned how to play the game. But underneath that, it tells us something sadder. Everyone else from his generation seems to have moved into another phase of life. They grew up, took command, built families, changed shape with time. Maverick stayed in the cockpit, and yes, that makes him legendary, but it also makes him lonely. The film keeps circling that idea without turning it into a speech. Maverick lives like someone who has mastered motion but avoided progress. He can fly through danger, but he cannot quite fly out of the past. Goose is still there. Iceman is still there. The choices Maverick made years ago are still there, waiting for him the moment Rooster walks into the story. That is when the past stops being background. Rooster is not just another pilot. He is the living reminder of Maverick's biggest wound. He is Goose's son, but he is also proof that grief does not stay neatly buried. It grows up. It gets older. It learns how to stare back at you. And Maverick has no easy answer for that. He has spent years trying to protect Rooster in his own way, but protection can become control when it is shaped by guilt. That is one of the strongest emotional complications in the film. Maverick thinks he is doing the right thing, or at least the least damaging thing, but Rooster experiences it as betrayal. Both of them are trapped by the same ghost. That is why Maverick's refusal to move on is not only personal, it affects everyone around him. His unresolved guilt becomes part of Rooster's life. His inability to let go becomes another obstacle the younger generation has to fly around. And that is a smart way to age this character. The movie could have simply celebrated him as the last great pilot. Instead, it lets us admire him and question him at the same time. His instincts are extraordinary, his loyalty is real, his courage is not fake. But courage in the air does not automatically become courage on the ground. That is the thing Maverick has to face. For decades, flying has been his answer to everything. It has been his identity, his escape, his proof that he still matters. But now the film places him in a situation where being brilliant is not enough. He has to confront the emotional wreckage he has spent years outrunning. And for Maverick, that may be harder than any mission, because the real danger is not just enemy missiles or impossible terrain. It is the possibility that the life he built around never slowing down has also kept him from healing. And that is where the film's real emotional idea starts to come into focus. Top Gun: Maverick is obviously a movie about speed, jets, danger, and impossible flying. That is the surface. That is the part everyone talks about first, and honestly, fair enough. The flying is the hook. But underneath all of that, the movie is really about the past, not just remembering it, not just honoring it, letting it go. And that is a much harder thing for this film to do than it sounds, because the entire existence of Top Gun: Maverick depends on the past. The movie only matters because people remember the original. Maverick only matters because of who he was. Goose only matters because of what happened. Iceman only matters because of the history between him and Maverick. So the film is in this strange position where it has to celebrate the past while also admitting that living there forever is dangerous. That is what gives the story its emotional shape. Maverick has built his whole life around not moving too far from the man he used to be. He still flies like he is trying to outrun time. He still acts like instinct can solve everything. He still carries Goose's death like an old injury that never healed properly. And then Rooster appears, and suddenly the past is not just a memory anymore. It has a face. That is what makes the conflict more painful. Maverick is not dealing with an abstract regret. He is dealing with the son of the man he lost. He is dealing with someone who carries Goose's name, Goose's shadow, and his own anger. Every time Maverick looks at Rooster, he is reminded that the past did not stay frozen in 1986. It kept moving, even if he did not. That is a quiet but powerful idea. Because letting go does not mean pretending the past never mattered. The movie is not saying Maverick should forget Goose or forget Iceman or forget the life that made him who he is. That would feel false. These memories are part of him. But there is a difference between carrying something and being trapped by it. Maverick has been trapped by it. So has Rooster in his own way. He is not simply angry because Maverick hurt him. He is also living under the pressure of a father he barely gets to define outside of legend. Goose is a memory to the audience. But for Rooster, he is an absence, a missing shape, something he has had to grow around. That is why both men need to move forward. Not because the past is unimportant, but because it has become too heavy. It is affecting how they trust, how they fly, how they see each other, and how they see themselves. And the film mirrors that same struggle on a larger level. As a sequel, Maverick also has to decide what to do with its own past. Does it simply recreate the first film? Does it reject it? Does it bury it? The answer is somewhere in the middle. It keeps the memory alive, but it also tries to push the story into a new emotional phase. That is when the movie works best. When the nostalgia is not just there to make us smile, but to show us what these characters have been unable to release. And I think that is why the film connects with people beyond the spectacle. Yes, the jets are thrilling. Yes, the sound is huge. Yes, the final mission is built like a crowd-pleasing machine. But the emotional reason it lands is simpler. Everyone understands what it feels like to be pulled backward by something unfinished, a loss, a mistake, a version of yourself you cannot quite leave behind. For Maverick, the challenge is not only surviving the mission, it is accepting that honoring the past does not mean staying there. And of course, the ghost hanging over all of this is Goose. Even after all these years, Goose's death is still the emotional wound that Top Gun keeps returning to. It is the thing that never really left Maverick. The first film used it as the big tragic turning point, the moment where Maverick's confidence finally crashed into consequence. But in Top Gun, Maverick, that loss feels older, quieter, and in some ways heavier. Because now we are not dealing with the shock of Goose dying. We are dealing with the life that continued after it. That is a different kind of pain. Maverick has had decades to live with what happened, and the movie makes it clear that time did not magically clean the wound. He did not simply become older and wiser and fully healed. He carried it with him. Maybe he learned how to function around it. Maybe he learned how to smile, fly, work, and keep moving, but he never really got free of it. And that makes Goose's presence interesting, because Goose is not physically in the movie in the same way the new characters are, but he shapes almost everything. He shapes Maverick's guilt. He shapes Rooster's anger. He shapes the way the audience looks at their conflict. Even when nobody is saying his name, the memory of him is sitting there between them. That is what legacy does in this film. It does not just inspire people, it complicates them. For Maverick, Goose is a friend he lost and a mistake he cannot completely forgive himself for, even if the facts around that death are more complicated than simple blame. For Rooster, Goose is a father he barely had the chance to know, but whose absence defines so much of his life. And for the audience, Goose is part of the emotional memory of the original film, which means the sequel can bring all of that history into the room without needing to explain every detail again. That is useful storytelling. But it is also risky, because when a movie builds so much emotion around a dead character from decades ago, it has to be careful not to turn grief into a shortcut. It cannot just say Goose and expect the entire audience to feel something automatically. The film has to show how that loss still affects the people who survived it. And for the most part, that is where Maverick finds its strongest emotional ground. The pain is not treated like a flashback trophy. It has consequences. Maverick's choices with Rooster are shaped by it. Rooster's distrust is shaped by it. The tension between them is not just about personality. It is about a shared wound they experienced from completely different sides. One man lost his best friend, the other lost his father, and somehow, both of them ended up blaming Maverick. That is a heavy place to build a relationship from. It also gives the sequel a reason to exist beyond aircraft and nostalgia. Goose's legacy is not just a callback to make fans remember the first film. It is the emotional debt the sequel has to deal with. The first movie left Maverick alive but scarred. This one asks what happens when that scar becomes part of someone else's life too. That is why Rooster matters so much. He turns Goose from a memory into a consequence. And once that happens, Maverick cannot keep treating the past like something he can privately carry. It is no longer just his pain. It has shaped Rooster too. It has shaped the mission. It has shaped the way Maverick teaches, protects, hesitates, and fears. So even though Goose is gone, the movie never really lets him disappear. He is the missing person at the center of the story. And in a film so obsessed with speed, machines, and motion, Goose's legacy is the thing that forces everything to slow down just enough to hurt. And then the film brings in Rooster. This is where the sequel could have easily become lazy, because introducing the son of Goose is such an obvious legacy sequel move that you can almost feel the studio logic behind it. Bring in the child of a beloved character, give him some unresolved anger, put him in the same world as the original hero, and suddenly the old emotional wound has a new face. That kind of thing can feel cheap if it is handled badly. But here, it mostly works. Rooster is not just there because the movie needs a younger pilot with a famous last name. His presence changes the temperature of the entire story. The moment Maverick realizes who he is dealing with, the mission stops being just a professional assignment. It becomes personal in a way Maverick cannot avoid. Because Rooster is not a memory. He is not an old photograph. He is not a flashback. He is not just Goose's mustache and piano scene brought back for nostalgia. He is a grown man standing in front of Maverick, carrying years of resentment, confusion, and pain that Maverick helped create, even if he did not mean to. That makes him more than a callback. Rooster represents the part of the past that kept living after Maverick tried to bury it. Goose died. But the consequences did not stop there. His son grew up. His son became a pilot. His son entered the same dangerous world that took his father away. And now Maverick is being asked to train him for a mission where survival is anything but guaranteed. That is a brutal emotional setup, because Maverick is not simply afraid of losing another pilot. He is afraid of losing Goose's son. And that difference matters. Every decision he makes around Rooster is tangled up with old grief. He wants to protect him, but protection from Maverick does not always feel like love. Sometimes it feels like control. Sometimes it feels like mistrust. And for Rooster, that is the wound. He does not see Maverick as the grieving friend trying to do the right thing. He sees the man who interfered with his future, the man who held him back, the man connected to the father he lost and the career he has had to fight for. That gives their relationship a natural bitterness. Rooster does not need to shout in every scene for us to understand it. There is a stiffness in him around Maverick, a refusal to give him the easy emotional reunion that a lesser version of this story might have forced too quickly. And that is important, because Rooster is not just there to forgive Maverick so the audience can feel better. He has his own burden. He has grown up under a legacy he did not choose, trying to prove himself in a world where everyone who knows his father's name might already have an idea of who he is supposed to be. That is a difficult place to live. If he fails, he is not Goose. If he succeeds, he is still Goose's son. The movie does not explore every corner of that idea as deeply as it could, but the foundation is strong. Rooster gives the film an emotional pressure point that the first movie never had. He turns the old tragedy into something active, something unresolved, something that still has the power to shape choices in the present. And Miles Teller fits that space well. He has enough of the visual echo of Goose for the connection to register immediately, but he does not play Rooster like a copy. He is more guarded, more wounded, less openly warm. There is a heaviness to him, like he has spent a long time trying to carry a name that everyone else remembers differently than he does. That is what makes him useful to the sequel. He is both familiar and new. He brings the audience back to Goose, but he also forces the story to move beyond Goose, because Rooster is not simply a symbol of what Maverick lost. He is a person Maverick has to face, respect, and eventually trust. And in a movie built around speed, Rooster is the emotional drag pulling Maverick back to the one thing he cannot outrun. The past did not stay buried. It grew up and learned to fly. The heart of the movie, at least emotionally, is the conflict between Maverick and Rooster, not the mission, not the aircraft, not even the nostalgia. Those things are the engine, sure. But the wound underneath the movie is sitting between these two men, and what makes their conflict work is that neither side is completely simple. Maverick is not some cold authority figure trying to block Rooster out of cruelty. He is carrying guilt. He is carrying fear. He is carrying the memory of Goose in a way that has shaped almost every decision he makes around Rooster. In his mind, he has probably spent years convincing himself that he was protecting the boy, but Rooster did not experience it that way. To him, Maverick is not just the legendary pilot who flew with his father. He is the man who stood in the way, the man who delayed his career, the man who made decisions about his future without giving him control over his own life. And that is a very different kind of betrayal. Because when someone hurts you while claiming they were protecting you, the pain becomes harder to untangle. You can understand their reason and still resent the result. You can know they were scared and still feel robbed. That is where Rooster's anger comes from. He is not just angry because Goose died. He is angry because Maverick is still there, still involved, still making choices, still standing in the space where his father should have been. And every time Maverick tries to guide him, Rooster hears something else underneath it: control, doubt, fear. The film gets a lot of mileage out of that tension because it does not resolve it immediately. These two do not just have one emotional conversation and move on. The distrust sits there. It follows them into training. It affects how they fly, how they listen, how they respond under pressure. And for Maverick, that creates a painful contradiction. He has to prepare Rooster for a mission that could kill him, while every instinct in his body wants to keep him safe. He has to teach him to be fast, decisive, and aggressive, while knowing that if Rooster makes one mistake, Maverick may feel like he has lost Goose all over again. That is brutal. It is also exactly the kind of emotional pressure this sequel needed. Without Rooster, Maverick's return could have been mostly about proving he still has it. With Rooster, the story becomes about whether Maverick can stop trying to control the consequences of a tragedy that happened decades ago. And Rooster has his own lesson to learn too. Because his resentment is understandable, but it also traps him. He is so cautious, so measured, so unwilling to fully trust Maverick that his pain starts to become part of how he flies. He is not reckless like Maverick. He holds back. He hesitates. He carries the weight differently, but he is still carrying it. That is what makes them mirror each other. Maverick cannot let go of guilt. Rooster cannot let go of anger. Both of them are flying with ghosts in the cockpit. Now, does the film explore this relationship as deeply as it possibly could have? Maybe not. There are moments where you can feel the blockbuster machinery wanting to move forward before the emotional drama has fully breathed. A quieter film might have sat with their conflict longer. It might have made the resentment messier, more uncomfortable, less neatly shaped for a final act payoff. But for the kind of movie this is, the conflict gives the story real weight. It turns the mission into more than a technical challenge. It gives every training run an emotional charge. When Maverick pushes Rooster, it is not just instructor versus student. It is guilt versus grief, protection versus independence, the past versus the future. And eventually, the movie has to bring them to the same place, not because everything is suddenly healed, that would be too easy, but because survival requires trust. At some point, both men have to stop flying against the memory of Goose and start flying with each other. That is the emotional test hidden inside the action movie. The mission asks whether they can hit the target. The story asks whether they can finally stop punishing each other for a loss neither of them can change. What I like about Rooster is that his conflict is not only about being angry at Maverick. That is the obvious layer, and the movie definitely uses it. He walks into the story with resentment already built into him. You can feel the history before anyone explains it, but underneath that anger is something a little more complicated. Rooster is carrying a father he barely got to know, and that is a strange kind of grief. It is not the same as Maverick's grief. Maverick remembers Goose as a friend, a partner, a man with a voice and jokes and a personality. He has actual memories to hold on to. Rooster, on the other hand, is living with a legacy that other people understand more clearly than he does. That can mess with a person. Because when your father becomes a legend to everyone else, where does that leave you? Are you supposed to live up to him, escape him, repeat him, prove you belong in the same world, or prove you are your own man? The film does not stop to spell all of that out, but it is sitting inside the character. Rooster is not reckless like Maverick. He does not fly like someone desperate to burn through every limit in front of him. He is more cautious, more controlled, sometimes to a fault. And that makes sense. He is not just trying to be good. He is trying not to become another tragedy. That is what gives his flying a different emotional texture. Maverick flies like he is running from the past. Rooster flies like he is afraid of repeating it. And those are two very different kinds of fear. The painful irony is that Rooster has chosen the exact life that took his father away from him. He becomes a pilot anyway. He enters the same dangerous world, trains under the same institution, and eventually ends up being taught by the man most closely connected to his father's death. That is not just career ambition. That is emotional unfinished business. He may not even fully know what he is looking for. Maybe he wants answers. Maybe he wants to prove he can survive what Goose did not. Maybe he wants to stand in the cockpit and feel close to a father who exists mostly as stories, photographs, and other people's memories. Whatever the reason, it gives Rooster a quiet heaviness, and Miles Teller plays him with that guarded quality. He does not make Rooster a loud, constantly explosive character. There is anger there, yes, but it is held back, tightened, controlled, like someone who has learned to keep his pain organized because if he lets it spill out, he might not know what to do with it. That is why his scenes with Maverick have such a stiff energy. Rooster does not want easy comfort from him. He does not want a father figure handed to him by the script. He does not want Maverick to simply explain everything and make the wound disappear. His pain has been with him too long for that, and that makes him feel more believable. He is not just Goose's son as a plot device. At least at his best, he is someone trying to live under a name that means something different to everyone around him. To Maverick, Goose is guilt. To the audience, Goose is nostalgia. To Rooster, Goose is absence. That distinction matters, because absence can become heavier than memory. Memory gives you something to hold. Absence gives you questions. So while Maverick is trying to make peace with the past, Rooster is trying to understand what the past even means for him. He is not simply stuck because he refuses to forgive Maverick. He is stuck because his whole identity has been shaped around someone who is no longer there. That is the emotional burden he brings into the cockpit. Every training run, every hesitation, every moment where he pulls back, you can read it as more than just a tactical flaw. It is a man trying to survive both the mission in front of him and the legacy behind him. And that is why Rooster works. He is not the flashiest pilot in the group. He is not the loudest. He is not the one stealing every scene with swagger. He is the one carrying the most ghosts. And then there is Iceman. This is one of those parts of Top Gun Maverick where the movie could have easily gone wrong. Bringing back Val Kilmer was always going to carry a lot of emotional weight, not just because of what Iceman meant in the original film, but because of what Kilmer himself brings into the scene now. And the film knows that. It does not overuse him. It does not try to force him into the story as a cheap nostalgia cameo. It gives him one important scene, and honestly, that is enough. Because when Iceman appears, the whole movie slows down in a way it really needs to. For most of the film, everything is movement. Jets, training, deadlines, pressure, competition. Even the emotional conflicts are pushed forward by the mission. But the Iceman scene feels different. It has stillness. It has history. It lets two characters sit in the same room with decades between them. And suddenly, the movie feels less like a sequel trying to honor the past and more like two old friends quietly facing it. That is why the scene works. Iceman is no longer just the rival from the first movie. He is not the cocky opponent, the polished golden boy, the man Maverick had to measure himself against. Time has changed that relationship. Whatever competition existed between them has turned into something gentler and more meaningful. There is respect now. More than that, there is understanding. Iceman sees Maverick in a way almost no one else does. The Admiral sees a problem. The young pilots see a legend or an obstacle. Rooster sees pain, but Iceman sees the whole person. He remembers the reckless young man, but he also sees the older man still carrying the same grief, the same guilt, the same inability to let go. And that gives the scene its power. It is not just, look, Iceman is back. It is not just the movie waving at fans of the original. It actually matters to Maverick's emotional journey. Iceman is the one person who can tell him the truth without it sounding like an order. He can push Maverick toward the thing he has been avoiding, not because he outranks him, but because he knows him. That history makes every quiet moment feel heavier. And then, of course, there is Val Kilmer himself. Knowing what Kilmer has gone through in real life adds a layer that the film does not need to explain too much. It is already there. You feel it in the way the scene is staged, in the way Cruz responds to him, in the way the movie lets silence and presence do more than dialogue could. It becomes one of the rare moments where the real world and the movie world overlap without feeling exploitative. That is difficult to pull off. A lesser film might have turned the scene into a sentimental spectacle. It might have pushed too hard, forced a bigger emotional release, or made the whole thing feel like a tribute video inside the movie. But Maverick shows a little restraint here. It lets the emotion come from the fact that these two men are simply together again, older now, changed now, but still connected. And that is enough. The scene also reminds us how much time has passed, not in a flashy way, not through a montage or a speech, just by letting Maverick and Iceman share space. You look at them and feel the distance between the first film and this one. You feel the years, you feel the losses, you feel the strange tenderness of seeing rivals become the people who understand each other best. For me, that is some of the strongest emotional material in the film. Because Iceman's return does not exist only to make the audience nostalgic, it gives Maverick permission, maybe even a command, to face what he has been running from. It reminds him that being loyal to the past does not mean staying trapped inside it. And after that scene, the movie feels a little different. The mission is still there. The jets are still waiting. The blockbuster machinery keeps moving. But for a moment, Top Gun, Maverick stops chasing speed and gives us something much quieter. A goodbye, a blessing, and one old friend telling another that it is finally time to move forward. What makes the Iceman scene even more important is that it does not exist in isolation. It is not just an emotional cameo. It is basically the film saying its central idea out loud, but in the gentlest way possible. Maverick has to move forward, and the reason that lands is because it comes from Iceman, not from a superior officer barking at him, not from a younger pilot challenging him, not from some obvious speech about growing up and changing with the times. It comes from the one person in the story who truly understands what Maverick has been carrying. That matters, because Iceman is part of the past too. He belongs to the same history Maverick keeps circling. He was there when Maverick was young, reckless, brilliant, and broken by Goose's death. He saw the version of Maverick that became legendary, but he also saw the damage underneath that legend. So when Iceman tells him, in his own way, that it is time to let go, it does not feel like the movie dismissing the past. It feels like the past itself giving Maverick permission to leave. That is a beautiful idea. Because Maverick's problem has never been that he does not care. If anything, he cares too much. He holds on to people, mistakes, guilt, and promises until they become part of his identity. He has confused loyalty with punishment. Somewhere along the way, remembering Goose became inseparable from blaming himself. Protecting Rooster became inseparable from controlling him. And Iceman sees that. He understands that Maverick cannot lead these pilots properly if he is still trying to rewrite history. He cannot help Rooster become his own man if he keeps seeing him only through Goose's death. He cannot survive emotionally if every decision is shaped by an old wound. That is why this scene quietly changes the movie. Before it, Maverick is still resisting the full truth of what he has to do. He wants to train the pilots, yes. He wants to complete the mission, yes. But emotionally, he is still trying to manage the past instead of releasing it. Iceman pushes him toward acceptance, and not in some neat, magical way. The movie does not pretend one conversation fixes decades of grief. That would feel false. But the scene gives Maverick something he has probably needed for years. Someone who knows the whole story telling him that holding on is no longer the same thing as honoring. That distinction is huge. Honoring Goose does not mean keeping Rooster frozen under protection. Honoring Iceman does not mean refusing to change. Honoring the past does not mean living like time stopped when the first movie ended, and that is also why the scene feels connected to the film as a sequel. Top Gun, Maverick, is doing the same thing Maverick has to do. It has to respect the past without becoming trapped inside it. It has to bring back old feelings, old music, old names, and old images, but then use them to move somewhere else. The Iceman scene becomes almost a quiet instruction manual for the whole movie. Remember where you came from. Respect what mattered. But do not confuse memory with life. That is the emotional wisdom Iceman brings, and maybe that is why his presence feels so powerful despite being brief. He does not need a lot of screen time. He carries the weight of decades with him. He represents friendship, rivalry, survival, age, illness, loyalty, and the strange grace of knowing when to tell someone the truth. For Maverick, that truth is painful. He cannot keep flying away from what happened. He cannot keep treating Rooster like a second chance to save Goose. He cannot keep defining himself only by the parts of his life that hurt the most. At some point, even Maverick has to land. And Iceman, more than anyone else in the film, is the person who helps him understand that landing does not mean surrender. Sometimes, it means finally being ready to live. Then, there is Penny Benjamin. And honestly, this is one of those parts of Top Gun, Maverick, that could have felt like a complete afterthought, because in a movie this focused on jets, legacy, training, and old emotional wounds, the romantic subplot is not exactly the main attraction. Nobody is walking into this film thinking, I really hope the love story gets equal screen time with the fighter planes. But the movie still needs something on the ground. It needs a part of Maverick's life that is not military orders, cockpit pressure, or unresolved guilt. It needs someone who can look at him not as Captain Mitchell, not as a legend, not as a problem for the Navy to deal with, but simply as Pete. That is where Penny comes in. What is interesting is that she is not treated like a random new love interest dropped into the sequel just because the movie needed romance. She has a connection to the old STSTSTTTSTS, Top Gun 4 world, even if she was only mentioned before and never really part of the original story on screen. So bringing her in gives the film a link to the past without literally trying to recreate the Charlie romance, and that was probably the right choice, because if the sequel had simply brought back the exact same romantic dynamic from the first film, it might have felt too neat, too nostalgic in the wrong way. Penny gives the movie a slightly different energy. She feels like someone who has known versions of Maverick over time, someone who has seen the charm, the irresponsibility, the disappearing act, and the damage that comes with loving a man who never really stays still. That makes their relationship feel lived in, even when the film does not spend a huge amount of time explaining it. You get the sense that this is not their first chapter. It is more like another attempt at something that has probably failed before. And that fits Maverick perfectly, because his romantic life seems to have the same problem as the rest of his life. He is good at intensity, not stability. Penny understands that. She is warm with him, but she is not naive about him. She likes him, maybe even loves him, but she also knows exactly what kind of man he is. She knows the smile, she knows the thrill, she knows the pattern. And Jennifer Connelly brings a lot to that. She gives Penny a calm, grounded presence that helps balance the movie. In a film full of competitive pilots and military pressure, she feels like an adult in the room. Not boring, not stiff. Just someone with a life, a daughter, a business, and enough history to not be dazzled by Maverick's whole routine. That is important. Because Maverick needs someone who is not impressed by the legend. The young pilots may look at him with suspicion or awe. The admirals may see him as a liability. But Penny sees the man behind all of that, and she is one of the few characters who can call him out without turning the scene into a confrontation. Their scenes are not the most explosive parts of the movie, and they are not meant to be. They work more like pauses, a breath between the training runs, a reminder that Maverick is not only facing professional consequences, but personal ones too. If he cannot stop living like every day is another dare, then what kind of life is he actually building? That is the quiet question Penny brings into the film. Now, is the romance deeply developed? Not really. The movie sketches it more than it fully explores it. There are moments where it feels like the film is relying on charm and history rather than giving the relationship a lot of dramatic weight on the page, but somehow it mostly gets away with it. Partly because Cruise and Connelly have an easy, mature chemistry. Their scenes do not feel like a forced young romance awkwardly inserted into an action movie. They feel age-appropriate, relaxed, and a little bittersweet. Two people who have made mistakes, drifted apart, circled back, and maybe still see something worth saving. And that is enough for the role this subplot plays. Penny is not there to take over the movie. She is there to give Maverick a glimpse of a life beyond the cockpit. A life where being brave might mean staying, not leaving, listening, not proving, letting someone know you before you disappear again. For a film this obsessed with speed, that matters, because Penny represents something Maverick has never been especially good at, a reason to come home. Now, the romance with Penny is one of those parts of the movie where I can understand both reactions. On one hand, it works better than it probably needed to. Cruise and Jennifer Connelly have a comfortable chemistry. It does not feel awkward. It does not feel like the movie is trying to convince us that Maverick is suddenly in some grand, sweeping romance that has to compete with the main plot. Their scenes have a lighter, more relaxed quality, and that helps the film breathe a little. There is also something refreshing about the fact that the romance feels age-appropriate and mature. This is not Maverick trying to relive his youth with someone who makes the movie feel like it is desperately chasing a younger audience. Penny feels like someone from his world, someone with her own history, her own life, and her own patience limits. She is not there just to look impressed when he walks into a room, and that matters because Maverick does not need someone who worships him. He needs someone who knows exactly how charming he can be, and exactly how exhausting that charm probably becomes after a while. That is the best version of their dynamic. But at the same time, I do think the romance is one of the thinner parts of the film. Not bad, just thin. The movie gives us enough to understand the relationship, but not always enough to deeply feel it. A lot of the emotional history between Maverick and Penny is implied rather than built. We are told, or at least strongly encouraged to believe, that there is a long pattern between them. They have known each other, missed each other, disappointed each other, come back to each other. And that can work, but it also means the film is leaning pretty heavily on the actors to sell what the script only lightly sketches. Luckily, Cruise and Connelly can do that. They give the scenes a warmth that may not be fully present on the page. Connelly especially brings this grounded, adult energy that keeps Penny from feeling completely decorative. She has a calm confidence, and she plays Penny like someone who has already survived the Maverick experience before. Still, I would not say the romance is one of the movie's strongest dramatic elements. It is pleasant, it is charming. It gives Maverick somewhere to go when the movie needs to step away from the airfield. But if you pulled it out, the main emotional structure of the film would still mostly remain intact. The real emotional engine is Maverick, Rooster, Goose, and Iceman. Penny is more like an emotional counterweight. She reminds us that Maverick's inability to move forward is not only about grief or military rank, it also affects his personal life. He is a man who can commit completely to a mission, but committing to a normal life, that is much harder for him. So the romance does have a purpose. It just does not always feel fully developed. There are moments where it feels natural and lived in, and then there are moments where it feels like the movie remembers, right, we need a love interest here. That is not a disaster, because the film never lets the subplot take over, but it does mean the romance sometimes feels more functional than essential, and depending on what you want from the movie, that may or may not bother you. If you are here for the jets, the mission, and the legacy drama, Penny's scenes probably feel like a nice pause. If you are looking for a deeply written romantic arc, there may not be quite enough there. For me, it lands somewhere in the middle. I like the chemistry. I like the maturity. I like that Penny gives Maverick a space where he can be more than the Navy's beautiful problem child. But I also wish the movie had given her a little more interior life beyond what she means to him. Because Jennifer Connelly is doing a lot with a role that sometimes feels smaller than it should be. She makes Penny feel real, even when the writing only gives us the outline of a real person. So yes, the romance works. But it works because of the actors, the tone, and the emotional texture around the edges, not because the subplot itself is especially rich. Jennifer Connelly deserves a little extra attention here, because even when Penny is not the deepest written character in the movie, Connelly gives her a presence that makes the subplot feel more grounded than it might have been otherwise. That is not always easy in a film like this. Top Gun, Maverick is so dominated by speed, military pressure, male rivalry, legacy, and Tom Cruise's whole action star gravity that a romantic interest could very easily disappear into the background. She could have been there just to smile at Maverick, tell him to be careful, and remind the audience that he has a personal life somewhere off the runway. But Connelly does not play Penny like decoration. She gives her this calm, lived-in confidence. Penny feels like someone who has been through enough life to not be overwhelmed by Maverick's charm. She likes him, clearly, but she is not dazzled by him. And that distinction matters, because Maverick is the kind of character who can easily bend a scene around himself. With Penny, he cannot completely do that. She knows him too well. There is something very effective about watching Maverick, this legendary pilot who still frustrates admirals and terrifies younger flyers, suddenly become a little less certain around her, not helpless, not awkward in a forced romantic comedy way, just slightly exposed. Like she is one of the few people who remembers that behind all the myth, he is also a man who has disappointed people, disappeared from relationships, and probably made the same mistake more than once. Connolly brings that history without needing a huge monologue. A look does a lot. A pause does a lot. The way she does not rush to forgive him does a lot. That is why Penny works better than the writing alone might suggest. The script gives us the outline of a woman who has known Maverick before and understands his patterns, but Connolly fills in the emotional texture. She makes you believe Penny has a life outside of the scenes we see. She owns a bar. She has a daughter. She has boundaries. She has warmth, but not endless patience. And in a movie full of people either challenging Maverick or admiring him, Penny feels like someone who simply sees him. That is a different kind of role. She is not there to compete with the fighter jets, because almost nothing in this movie is going to compete with the fighter jets. But she gives the film a softer register. Her scenes allow Maverick to exist outside the cockpit without the entire movie losing momentum. That is important because the film needs a reminder that Maverick's life cannot just be measured in missions survived. What happens after the adrenaline fades? Who is waiting? What kind of future is he actually capable of building? Penny does not answer all of those questions, but her presence makes them visible. And I think that is why the casting works. Connolly brings maturity without making the scenes feel heavy. She brings beauty, obviously, but also a sense of emotional steadiness. There is a quiet authority to her performance. She does not need to dominate the movie to matter inside it. If anything, she gives Maverick something the rest of the film rarely gives him, a place where being impressive is not enough. In the air, Maverick can prove himself through skill. With the younger pilots, he can prove himself through experience. With the Navy, he can prove himself through results. But with Penny, the question is different. Can he stay? Can he listen? Can he be trusted when there is no mission forcing him to show up? That is what Connolly quietly brings to the film. She turns what could have been a very standard romantic subplot into something warmer, more adult, and more believable than expected. The role may be limited, but the presence is not. One thing that is noticeable about a Top Gun, Maverick, is how selective it is about the past. The movie brings back Maverick. It brings back Iceman. It brings back Goose through Rooster, through memory, through music, through the emotional shape of the story, but it does not bring everyone back. And that choice is worth talking about, because when a sequel arrives this many years later, especially one built so openly around legacy, there is always that temptation to turn it into a reunion. Bring back every familiar face. Give everyone a cameo. Let the audience point at the screen every 10 minutes and say, "Oh, I remember them." Emmerich mostly avoids that. Kelly McGillis is not here. Meg Ryan is not here. Tom Skerritt is not here. And depending on how attached you are to the original, that might feel strange at first. These characters were part of the old film's emotional and visual memory, so their absence does leave a little space around the edges. But I can also understand why the sequel does not force them in. This movie is already carrying a lot of nostalgia, maybe too much in places. If it had also tried to bring back every original character, it could have started to feel less like a story and more like a roll call. And that is one of the dangers with legacy sequels. They can become so busy honoring the past that they forget to create a present. So instead, the film chooses its returns carefully. Iceman matters because his presence changes Maverick's emotional journey. Goose matters because his absence still shapes the central conflict. Those pieces are not just references, they are structural. They affect what Maverick does, what Rooster feels, and what the film is actually about. The missing characters, on the other hand, would have needed a real reason to be there, and maybe the movie simply did not have room for that. Still, their absence does say something. It reminds us that time has passed in a way that is not always neat or sentimental. Not everyone from the past stays in the story. Not every relationship gets revisited. Not every old face returns for closure. That actually fits the movie more than a full reunion would have. Maverick's life, as we see it here, is not full of people from the first film standing around waiting for him. It is full of gaps, losses, old names, people who moved on, people who disappeared, people who are remembered more than seen. There is a quiet realism in that, even inside a movie that is otherwise very polished and very blockbuster. Of course, you can still argue that some exclusions feel convenient. The movie has time for certain callbacks, certain musical cues, certain recreated images, but not for every character who mattered before. That selectiveness can feel a little calculated. It keeps only the pieces of the past that serve this particular version of Maverick's story. But that is also what keeps the film from becoming overcrowded. A legacy sequel has to make choices. And Top Gun, Maverick, chooses to focus less on reunion and more on consequence. It is not really asking, where is everyone now? It is asking, what parts of the past still have power over Maverick? That is why Goose and Iceman remain essential, and why the others, even if missed, stay outside the frame. Their absence may not satisfy everyone, but it does keep the movie pointed in one direction. This is not a class reunion. It is not a nostalgia parade. It is Maverick being forced to face the memories that still have unfinished business with him. And after all the talk about legacy, nostalgia, politics, character arcs, and whether the film leans too hard on the past, there is one very simple thing that has to be said. Top Gun, Maverick, is just extremely entertaining. That sounds basic, I know, almost too basic. But sometimes that is the thing a blockbuster has to get right before anything else matters. You can have themes, callbacks, emotional baggage, technical ambition, all of that. But if the movie does not actually move, if it does not give the audience that feeling of being pulled into the screen, then the whole machine starts to feel pointless. This movie moves. It has that clean, old-fashioned sense of momentum where each scene feels like it is pushing you closer to something. Even when the story is predictable, even when you can sense where certain emotional beats are going, the film rarely feels dead. It keeps giving you a reason to stay with it. Part of that is the mission structure. Part of it is Tom Cruise. Part of it is the flying. And part of it is simply that the movie understands rhythm better than most modern legacy sequels. It knows when to slow down for emotion, when to bring back a familiar cue, when to let the pilots clash, and when to throw the audience into the air and let the jets do the talking. And honestly, once the planes are in the sky, the movie becomes very hard to resist. There is a physical thrill to those sequences that you do not always get from big studio action anymore. You feel the speed, you feel the pressure, you feel the pilot straining inside the cockpit. Even if you know the story is built to satisfy, even if you know the film is designed to send people out smiling, the action still has a pulse. That is why so many people responded to it. It is not because the plot is revolutionary. It is not because every character is deeply written. It is not because the movie has something brand new to say about war, aviation, or American mythology. It is because it delivers. Sometimes that is enough. There is a kind of confidence in Maverick that feels almost refreshing now. It is not embarrassed to be a big crowd movie. It is not constantly winking at the audience to prove it knows it is cheesy. It is not trying to undercut every sincere moment with a joke. When it wants to be emotional, it is emotional. When it wants to be thrilling, it goes all in. When it wants to be corny, it just accepts that as part of the package. And that sincerity helps, because this kind of movie can become ridiculous very easily. Fighter pilots speaking in dramatic one-liners, old wounds resurfacing at the perfect moment. A nearly impossible mission with a tiny window of success. A hero who is still somehow better than everyone else after all these years. On paper, it is a lot. But the film plays it with enough craft and conviction that you stop fighting it. You settle into the ride. You let the old-school blockbuster energy do what it is supposed to do. That does not mean the movie is flawless. It is safe in places. It is familiar. It has thin supporting characters. Some of the nostalgia is heavy. Some of the emotional beats are very clearly engineered. But entertainment is not always about surprise. Sometimes it is about execution. It is about taking familiar ingredients and serving them with enough speed, polish, and feeling that the audience still leaves satisfied. And that is exactly what Top Gun, Maverick does. It reminds you that a movie can be simple without being empty, conventional without being lifeless, nostalgic without feeling completely hollow. It is a polished piece of mainstream filmmaking that knows what it is selling and, more importantly, knows how to sell it well. By the time the final stretch arrives, the movie has done enough groundwork that the spectacle feels earned. You understand the mission. You understand the emotional stakes. You understand why Maverick has to be there, why Rooster matters, why the team has to come together, and why the whole thing is built to make the audience grip the seat a little tighter. That is entertainment craft. Not subtle maybe, not groundbreaking, but effective. And sometimes, especially with a movie like this, effective is exactly what you came for. One of the strangest things about Top Gun Maverick is that it actually lived up to the hype. And I do not say that lightly, because hype can be poisonous for a movie like this. When people keep telling you a blockbuster is amazing, when the reviews are glowing, when audiences are walking out acting like they have just witnessed the resurrection of cinema itself, it becomes very easy to sit down with your arms crossed and think, all right, impress me. That is a dangerous position for any film to be in, especially a sequel like this. Because before watching it, skepticism feels completely reasonable. A decades-later follow-up to an 80s classic, Tom Cruise returning to one of his most famous roles, a story built around nostalgia, young pilots, familiar music, and fighter jets, that could have easily been empty. It could have been another legacy sequel praised mostly because people wanted to feel something familiar again. And for some viewers, maybe that is exactly how it played. Not everyone bought into it. There are definitely people who found the movie overpraised, too safe, too nostalgic, too polished for its own good. And I understand that reaction. When a film receives this much praise, the flaws can start to feel louder. The conventional plot, the heavy callbacks, the underdeveloped side characters, the political vagueness, if those things bother you, the hype probably makes them bother you even more. Because then you are not just reacting to the movie, you are reacting to the conversation around the movie. That matters. Sometimes a good film gets turned into an impossible object by the way people talk about it. It stops being, this is a really strong blockbuster, and becomes, this is the movie that saved theaters. And once the conversation reaches that level, disappointment becomes almost unavoidable for anyone who does not have the same emotional response. But I also think the audience reaction makes sense. Because Top Gun, Maverick arrived at a moment when people were hungry for exactly this kind of movie. A clean, muscular, emotional, practical-looking, big-screen action film that did not feel like homework. It was not asking viewers to remember 10 other installments, track multiverse rules, or wait for the post-credit setup. It gave people a mission, a movie star, a legacy wound, and action scenes that actually felt physical. That kind of simplicity can hit hard when it is done well. And this film is done well. That is why so many people walked out buzzing. Not because it is flawless, it is not, but because it delivers a feeling that a lot of modern blockbusters chase and do not always catch, the feeling that you saw something made for the big screen, made with effort, made with confidence, and made to send the audience out satisfied. There is value in that. You can criticize the film's safety and still understand the pleasure of it. You can point out the predictable beats and still admit they land. You can see the nostalgia machinery working and still feel yourself respond when the music rises and the jets tear across the screen. That is the push and pull of Maverick. For fans of the original, it probably felt like a gift. For people who were lukewarm on the first film, it may have been a surprise. For viewers who already dislike this kind of military action fantasy, it was probably never going to fully win them over. But the fact that it connected so widely says something. It says audiences were not only responding to the brand name, they were responding to the craft, to the clarity, to the sense of effort, to the idea that a blockbuster can be old-fashioned without feeling completely dead. That is why the hype, while maybe inflated in places, was not fake. There is a real movie underneath it, a very polished movie, a very calculated movie, a movie that knows exactly how to press certain buttons, but also a movie that presses them with skill. And in the end, that is why the audience response does not feel like some random wave of nostalgia blindness. It feels like people recognizing a type of cinematic pleasure they had missed, even if, depending on your taste, that pleasure may come with a few too many familiar chords playing in the background. So where does that leave Top Gun Maverick in the end? For me, it lands as one of those rare legacy sequels that probably should have been unnecessary, and yet somehow justifies itself. Not perfectly. Not without flaws, not without moments where you can feel the nostalgia machine working a little too hard, but it justifies itself more than most movies like this ever do, because the easy version of this film would have been simple. Bring back Tom Cruise, play the music, show the jets, mention Goose, give the audience a few familiar images, a young cast, a final mission, and let everyone leave feeling like they visited an old memory. And yes, Maverick does some of that. It absolutely uses nostalgia. It absolutely knows when to press the old emotional buttons. It knows that people want the sound, the speed, the jacket, the call signs, the competitive energy, and the feeling of watching fighter jets tear through the sky like cinema itself was built for that exact image. But the reason the film works is that it does not stop there. At its best, Top Gun, Maverick understands that returning to the past is not the same as living in it. The movie is about nostalgia, but it is also suspicious of nostalgia. It gives Maverick the old world again, then forces him to realize that the old world cannot save him unless he is willing to change. That is what gives the spectacle some emotional weight. Maverick is not just trying to prove he can still fly. He is trying to face the guilt he never escaped, the friendships he has lost, the relationships he has damaged, and the younger generation that now has to fly into danger without being trapped by his fear. And around that emotional core, the film builds an impressively clean blockbuster. The mission is clear, the stakes are readable, the training has purpose, the action is genuinely thrilling. That may sound basic, but it is amazing how many modern blockbusters forget those basics. Maverick does not. It knows how to build tension, how to pace a final mission, how to make the audience understand the danger, and how to turn physical filmmaking into part of the emotional experience. The aerial sequences are not just technically impressive. They give the movie its pulse. They are the reason the film feels alive in a way that so much weightless digital spectacle does not. You feel the pressure, you feel the speed, you feel the bodies inside the machines. And even when the story is doing something predictable, the filmmaking gives it force. Still, I do not think the movie is beyond criticism. Some supporting characters could have been richer. The romance works more because of the actors than because of the writing. The callbacks sometimes feel heavy. The enemy is vague in a way that can make the politics feel too clean, too safe, too carefully sanded down. And if you are not already open to this kind of old-school military action fantasy, I doubt the movie will completely change your mind. There are also times when the film is very aware of its own legend, maybe too aware. It wants to honor the original, revive theatrical spectacle, protect Tom Cruise's star image, satisfy longtime fans, introduce new pilots, resolve old wounds, and deliver a crowd-pleasing ending. That is a lot of pressure for one movie, and occasionally you can feel it trying to carry all of that at once. But somehow, most of the time, it holds, and that is the achievement. Top Gun, Maverick is not great because it is original. It is not great because it reinvents the action genre or tells a story nobody has seen before. It is great, or at least extremely effective, because it takes familiar material and executes it with conviction, precision, and enough emotional honesty to make the familiarity feel satisfying instead of hollow. It is cheesy, but usually knowingly so. It is nostalgic, but not completely trapped. It is conventional, but rarely lazy. It is polished, but not lifeless. And most importantly, it remembers that a blockbuster should make you feel something in the moment, not just recognize a brand, not just wait for the next installment, not just admire the budget, feel something. A little excitement, a little sadness, a little tension, a little ridiculous movie star joy. That old, almost embarrassing thrill of watching a big-screen action movie do exactly what it promised to do. That is why Top Gun, Maverick connected. It gave people the past, but with enough present-tense energy to make it feel alive again. And for a sequel arriving 36 years later, that is not a small thing. That is almost a miracle.